Welcome to A Quaker Take on Sex. A Quaker Take is a podcast from Quakers in Britain exploring a Quaker perspective on the world.
I'm John.
And I'm Elizabeth.
Sex is a really important and pretty taboo topic to talk about. The Quaker perspective on it is way more interesting and broad than I would have assumed, definitely more than I would have assumed of any Christian group.
Yeah, it was really interesting researching and reflecting on the history of Christianity in this country and the way that that's impacted our understanding of sex and sexuality. It certainly has a lot of patriarchal overtones. It denies the existence of LGBT people, denies the understanding of female pleasure. And so we have this really long history and this culture of shame that we've inherited, and certain things kind of happen in Quaker history where there's been a bit more of a shift.
Yeah, so Quakers are probably known in the current century for same-sex marriage, but that didn't spring up out of nowhere. And whilst Quakers aren't the only ones thinking about that stuff, it's quite interesting because often Quakers talk about how, we've been thinking about this since the 60s. But when you actually look at what they were talking about in the 60s, it was much broader than just same-sex relationships.
Yeah, when the 11 Quakers got together in 1963 to draw together the thoughts on this, they published a pamphlet called Towards a Quaker View on Sex. And they weren't claiming to be the authority on the Quaker perspective, but they were trying to shift the conversation amongst Quakers. But they wrote this pamphlet because younger Quakers were asking for help with what they called homosexual difficulties. And as part of the research around that, they realised that they couldn't talk about gay sex without also talking about all kinds of sex and sexuality and relationships, and that it was all inherently part of one thing. And when it eventually came down to it, it was all about what is the nature and quality of the relationship, and that's what's the important thing.
Yeah, so as part of the process for when we do a Quaker Take, we tend to look in Quaker Faith and Practice, which is kind of like the Quaker manual, and it has lots of contributions from Quakers all throughout history. And when I turn to the pages on sex, it's not just talking about same-sex relationships. It's, as you say, it's talking about pleasure, not being inherently wrong, positive relationships. There's less of this lens. Certainly I have known in other Christian contexts where it says, you cannot do this, can't have sex without marriage, it must be between a man and a woman. It's just not there. So it's a really interesting topic for the podcast, and we've looked at that and we've interviewed some people to see what they think about it today. And I think one of the things that comes across really strongly when thinking about Quaker view on sex is that we're rubbish about talking about it in society. And I'm not sure Quakers are amazing at talking about it, but I think we're certainly better, and talking about it is in many ways the Quaker take on sex.
It's one of those topics that I think people feel really awkward about, but we're going to be talking about it in quite an open and frank way on this episode. And it starts with a conversation with Lucy-Anne Holmes, who, as she describes it, wrote a sex memoir. And the book is called Don't Hold My Head Down. And so it's all about her sexual journey and also about spirituality. It's a really interesting interview. I really hope people enjoy it.
Yeah, it's really good. And that's the first part. And then if you stick around for the second part of this episode, we talk about it in context, and we talk about stuff like consent, how we talk about this sort of thing in wider society, where do young people fit into this? And we've got two interviews, one with David Brockway from the Good Lad Initiative, and another one with Elsie Whittington, who is a researcher, Quaker and lecturer who works on youth participation in relationships and sex education. So yeah, stick around for that stuff in the second half. But first, let's hand over to you and Lucy.
I'm here with campaigner and author Lucy-Anne Holmes. Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
Hi. So you recently wrote a book called Don't Hold My Head Down, which is all about your journey around sex and exploring that. And I wondered what motivated you to write the book?
So I came from a rom-com writing background. So I'd written 4 novels, which were romantic comedies, very much marketed as chick lit, actually. And they did well. And I had a bit of a experience around that, and actually I was sort of moving towards feminism, or thinking about the female experience and how we're allowed to express it. So I had a bit of a journey around writing chick lit, if you like. And then I started a campaign against the Sun's page 3, as you do. And I was on a train one day to somewhere up north to talk about the fact that there were boobs of young women in the paper. And my writing agent called, and she was like, Lucy, let's try and get you another book deal. So why don't you get some ideas together for fiction, for some more rom-coms, and we'll try and get you another deal. And so I was on the train thinking, and when you're writing stories, sort of fiction, you're looking for, so you want a character who then, it sort of has an experience that catapults them on a journey. And that journey, that person will be beset by disaster, but ultimately their quest will be successful, and they will find that they're ultimately changed in a good way by the end of the story. So that's what you're looking for. That's what I was looking for. And I just kept getting this voice in my head going, the story you need to be writing is how you came to be here, i.e. on a train about to talk to a load of young people about booze and paper, because I had been on such a transformative journey, but that journey was around sex. So I thought maybe that's the story I should be writing, and I kept having that feeling. But the part, because it is quite an intimate journey book, I kept having that, do you really want to write that book? Do you really want to go in that?
Public
Yeah. So, but eventually it was the book that didn't go away. So it did take years and years and years eventually to get it done. But yeah, that sort of is how it came about.
When I was reading through it, the first thing that struck me was the first few chapters and that whole introduction to it. There was a familiarity to the awkwardness of how it was written. I just remember like playing over very similar conversations about not feeling able to ask for what I wanted, really.
Yeah.
And also I realised that I was also in a different place when I was reading it, that there was a harking back to a slightly early, which made me feel actually very comfortable with where I am now, although it's a very different journey to probably the one that you've been on. But yeah, I wondered how that was for you, being able to reflect back on where you started and moved forward.
Yeah, so to maybe give a little potted story of the book. So yeah, the story starts with me. I have an epiphany, if you like, whilst watching pornography, and it freaks me out, and it gets me thinking about sex and how we're presenting sex. And I start to be quite concerned about my nieces. I've got 4 nieces who are younger than me, and I just kept thinking, gosh, this is the sex we're giving young people, you know. And they're turning on to pornography, and this is what they think sex is. And then I was like, gosh, this is awful. And then I started thinking about my own sex life, and I was like, well, Lucy, you're hardly raising sex to some divine art form, sat here watching online porn one night. So and actually what I did is I started thinking, well, if this isn't the sort of if I'm not, my friend's got this expression, if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. And I thought, well, if I want to do something different, if I don't want to get what I've always got in the realms of sexuality, what do I want? So I actually said to myself, what do you want to experience when it comes to sex? And that for me was radical because I'd never asked myself. And now I was in my mid-30s for the first time going, what do you want to experience sexually? And the results were quite surprising. Not surprising in the sense that, you know, I want to, you know, latex and ball gags and, you know, lots of paraphernalia. It was actually, I want to experience really slow sex. I felt that sex had been caught up in speedy routines for a long time. And I wanted to break it back down and work out how to touch a man, how I wanted to be touched. And I mentioned man then, but then I was thinking, I've always had, you know, fantasies about women. You know, I think I'm not maybe as straight as I've always thought I was. So it opened up a lot for me. I read that women are capable of 14 different types of orgasm. And I was like, if that's the case, I am majorly underperforming. But I want to explore my own pleasure. So I sort of set off on this big journey. And actually was beset by disaster. And one of the things that, you know, you mentioned is not being able to ask for what you wanted. And that was a big one for me. Because, you know, I was able to get, you know, I felt I was a relatively strong person, able to get some stuff done in my life, doing quite exciting things. Yet when it came to sex, I couldn't ask for what I wanted. I was just incapable of asking for what I wanted. I needed a lot of alcohol inside me to do it. Oh, as you can imagine, did it terribly. But I also hated my body. And I don't use the word hated lightly. I really was heaping a lot of loathing on my body. So it was very hard to experience these wonderful things with that loathing, and also with not being able to voice what I wanted to another person. So I had to kind of, you know, I unpicked a lot of these. I kept asking, why am I like this? Why am I like this? And then trying to break through. So yeah, so and the journey is quite funny in a lot of places. But yes, so a sense of looking back now. So you were asking me about how it is to look back now. I mean, really, I still am surprised at how I was so, I think naive is the word, and I remember feeling, you know, there I was, this woman in my mid-30s, but I felt when it came to sex and relationships, I felt like a girl. I felt like, oh, this is an area I haven't really developed in properly, fully. Mm-hmm. So I suppose I sort of look back quite tenderly at myself, but I love the fact that I am, you know, so much more confident to, you know, try new things and express myself, and I have a lot of love for myself now, which is amazing and empowering. And I think we use this word empowering a lot. I heard it a lot when it came to No More Page 3, this word empowering, and what is empowering. And for me, just finding that love for myself and learning about myself and being able to say, no, or oh, could you, touch me a bit more tenderly, or whatever it is. But being able to do that for me is really empowering. I think for women, we're told that to be kind of, I don't know, sexually empowered, you need to learn to pole dance, and you need to go to Ann Summers and get this underwear or whatever it is. But it wasn't. It was actually learning to say, oh no, I'm not ready for that. And so that was really empowering. So it was a very empowering journey for me, and I just wondered that if it was so empowering for me, would it be for other people? So that's why I wrote the book, really.
Yeah, because most of it is about that whole journey, but you also describe it at some points as a spiritual journey as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, and that's, for me, this has been the best part of it for me, and the part that keeps opening up more and more, and the part that I really want to explore more and more. Because I'm a Quaker now. I've been a Quaker for some years now, but I grew up, actually I started Church of England but went to a Catholic convent and then became a Catholic while I was at my Catholic convent, because I felt part of the Catholic community and not a Church of England community, and everyone was getting confirmed, and I was like, can't I be confirmed with you? So I essentially was a Catholic, and so I had 13 years in a Catholic convent, was taught by nuns, and very much just absorbed this, that sex is sinful. Sex is sinful. Definitely can't have it before you're married. Definitely it's just to make children. But the sense that the nuns had taken a vow of chastity, so there was no sex. So sex was going to get in the way of your connection with divine. There was this massive statue in our chapel of the Virgin Mary. So here's a woman who has had a baby, but not through sex because it's so dirty, so this sense that sex was dirty and was in shadow, and then but your body as a teenager is having all these these sort of feelings, and it's like, what do you do? How do I find out about this? So then you scurry, and then it's like VHS copies of porn and or whatever it is to learn or to find out, or whatever it says in More magazine, or so you're scurrying around in the shadows for some information about this sex thing. And so I think my upbringing around sex, it was quite shadowy, it was something sinful. So whilst that was going on, my body as a woman was something that I learnt wasn't mine, and this was quite a weird thing. So I was bringing in page 3 here. So you're learning about yourself as a woman from a lot of information that's around you, and one big thing for me was the page 3 in the newspaper. So I grew up with a couple of newspapers in the house. There was the Sun and I think the Times or something. I paid no attention to the other one because the Sun told me stories about pop stars and it was colour and I could read it because it's quite simpler written. But every day there's this massive image of a young woman in her pants. And at the time I was growing up, the women were 16. It was Sam Fox. If you go back to some of the stuff, it was shocking. It was like Sam Fox dressed as a schoolgirl going, I like to be taken roughly by surprise, and stuff like that. I mean, it's
wow.
It is mind. It throws you when you look at the kind of archive copies of the Sun that was around. But it was everywhere. If you got a packet of peanuts at the sailing club that we used to go to, my family, you pulled them away and there was a woman with her boobs out, and it was just sort of, there was Benny Hill. There was just it was just this sense that particularly your boobs, but your body was really there as decoration and titillation for men. So there was this real sense that the public space belonged to men, and that women were kind of some sort of sport and titillation and part of that. So I was absorbing a lot of that as well. So what I was learning growing up about my body and my sexuality was really, looking back, kind of a little bit warped, but then cut to going on this journey, and I just sort of thought I wanted to, explore my sexuality a bit more. But what I kept coming up with again and again was that I was having these experiences that were transcendent, mystical, mind-blowing, if you like, and I felt like they were healing me on a really deep level. I'm feeling a bit tingly and emotional even just mentioning it. And so whereas sometimes I think I'd thought, you go on a sex journey, it's really edgy and I shouldn't be talking about it, but actually it felt like I was going on this sex journey, and it was like the universe was saying, oh my God, what took you so long? And I was really being held by by spirit in a really beautiful way, just like learning about, oh my God, the pleasure I was capable of, but it felt, so exquisite and powerful. And I talk about the and I talk about in the book, and I call it the orgasm that could create world peace.
Yeah.
Kind of quite an understated title.
It's the line that has definitely been repeated in most of the reviews, I think.
Yeah, and it's strange, isn't it, really? Like, I just had this, so I kind of went on a real journey with my self-pleasure, because I start the book by watching pornography and having a furtive masturbate with online pornography, which has hitherto had been how my masturbatory habit sort of looked. And then I lose the screens and start actually connecting to myself, not via a screen, which was very good. But I start to connect with my body and myself in a really healing way. So I start to kind of just breathe into my body and see where it wants to be touched. And that used to take me on these really big journeys. So sometimes it would just lead me to like hold a bit of my intimate self and cry, and cry for maybe times that part hadn't been so tenderly touched. And, experiences would come back of situations I'd allowed myself to get into, but that were maybe a bit violent or not loving or not good. And so there would be kind of healing was happening as I was connecting to myself in this intimate but beautiful way. And I started to explore my own pleasure and to see where I wanted to go. And the more I kind of allowed this to happen, and the more I kind of actually cried, and it was like I was opening up myself to more pleasure and more sensitivity. So it felt like this journey, this kind of amazing kind of labyrinth that just kept unfolding for me. Yeah, and then there was this one night where I just was following myself and my pleasure and what was happening, and I just had this orgasm that just went on and on and on. I just felt like I was being ricocheting through. I was just like going through space and time, and it was just like, it was amazing. And as I came kind of off the kind of crescendo bit of it, I just had this, like, it was almost like I had a message. And I feel it's kind of Quaker because we do, we listen to spirit, we listen to spirit for those words from spirit that it's not the chatter of the mind. It is something. It is a different way of experiencing message from spirit. So I kind of feel that Quakers should get this, but it felt like, the message I was getting was, this is it. This is the secret that's been lost. And I was like, and it sounds ridiculous that I got this message, but I did. And this is our female pleasure, our power, our pleasure, our autonomy over that has been lost, like, completely. So it's not such a crazy message. No. But this feeling in my body and this message was ricocheting through me, like this sensations, the quivering in my body was going on for like days afterwards. It was amazing. So it really did feel like, yeah, so I went off did I go on a bit of a tangent? Oh, spirituality. So yeah, so and it's opening up, it just opens up more and more to me that actually I think for me it kind of feels like my body and my, sexuality, is a way to connect with the divine and with the spirit, and through myself and my own self-pleasure, and also in connection with another person in a really beautiful way. So, and it feels really, what I find quite interesting is I wrote the book about sex, but the really edgy part for me is talking about the spirituality with it, and I'm kind of getting better at it. But it felt like, that feels quite edgy, and I suppose I'm always really curious about what I'm afraid to say. And I was very afraid, previously to say what I wanted sexually, and now I'm able to do that. It's great. But it was for a long time really edgy for me to talk about spirituality. Like, I was terrified to talk about spirituality.
I mean, religion, politics and sex, they're like the three things that we avoid talking about. Yeah. So it kind of makes sense that having been on this journey of exploring sexually and becoming more comfortable talking about that actually there's another parallel thing that happens with spirituality. And I mean, because you've also done the politics bit in terms of this exploring the feminism and campaigning and that kind of thing, that's I mean I may be making too much of those three things, but you mentioned that you'd been a Quaker for a little while, but you weren't when you started on the journey. How did Quakers react when you came out with the book, or when you started telling people? How did that conversation go?
Yeah, it's been amazing, I have to say, but I was worried. So I'm a Quaker warden, my family, I'm really involved in elders and overseers and children's meeting. I mean, I'm really involved in the heart of my meeting, and I love it. And I'm a warden, so we live there. So that's quite... But obviously this book that is part of me and I feel very passionately about. And I suddenly panicked, actually, and we have a Becoming Friends group. And I said to these amazing Quakers who lead our Becoming Friends group at the end of the thing. This is a while before the book came out. I was like, oh my goodness, so I've got this book. I've written this book. They're like, oh, wonderful. And I was like, it's about sex. It's a sex memoir. And they were like, and I thought, and I was just so worried because you just suddenly think, you know, I've got cast out of my community that I love and my home, and it was all going to be awful. And they were like, amazing. They were like, these are the conversations that we should be having as Quakers, and do you remember this book that was written, and do you remember the pamphlet, and do you remember, you know, and they were just like, yes, no, this is what Quakers are about. We're about these conversations. And that was just, and we need to have a launch party for you. They were like, so that was really lovely. And then I told various people in the meeting, and it's been great. But actually the day before the book came out, I went on Women's Hour. I had this really wonderful interview with Jenny Murray. It was really kind of a great experience. And when I came off air, I'd had messages from some Quakers saying, oh, it's so great to hear you on Women's Hour, so proud of you, and that's brilliant. And my favourite response, though, was when I went to another meeting, to the children's meeting there, and the lady who was running the children's meeting at the end said, we need to talk. I wrote a sex book 25 years ago. And I was just like, I love it. So I feel really supported by the meeting. Yeah, and particularly because our meeting's got, you know, it's a big age range, and we've got some people who are, you know, I had no idea they were as old as they are, but in their 90s, and the response has been really, you know, respectful and positive. So yeah, I feel really blessed to be part of the Quaker community.
That's so interesting, especially if you're thinking about the sort of breadth of that all-age community. And those people who are 90 would have, who may well have been around with Quakers around in the 1960s, but when the book Towards a Quaker View of Sex came out, and that kind of really sparked conversations amongst Quakers about it, and probably, I don't know enough about the history, but that certainly looking at the response both within Britain and also worldwide, it does seem like that really exploded conversations. Yeah, that then you've got this whole community that is able to hold that in a different way, and the way that we've explored and understood sex over the decades has changed. I'm now just going off on a tangent.
I love it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. And even now when we're thinking about LGBT sex education, inclusive education and that kind of thing, like how that is framed for younger generations is beginning to shift. And yeah, like I was born in the same decade that Section 28 came in, like that stuff is really important. And so yeah, I guess you talked a little bit as well about your journey thinking about, are you attracted to women, and exploring that side of yourself, whether you're bisexual, and I wondered how that part of the journey was for you.
Yeah, that was really fascinating for me, because as I said, I was in my mid-30s and I'd never really thought about what I wanted sexually, and it suddenly struck me as absolutely ridiculous that throughout my whole life I had fantasies and been attracted to women. And except for some, oh my goodness, so drunk experiences in my 20s, I'd never thought or allowed myself to think that could actually be a reality. And just like, it blew my mind a bit, because I was really thinking, I think we're so socialised to be straight. It's just like, you know, it is. You know.
We live in a heteronormative society.
Yeah, and I couldn't work it out also, because we live in a heteronormative society. So many of the images that we're presented to are for heterosexual men. So I was like, am I finding women attractive because I'm just seeing the world through this heterosexual man prism that's been given to me, and you know, we're all sexual, so that's what that's what I'm finding is sexually attractive, or what is going on? And all I could say was that I think my sexuality is a lot more fluid and interesting than I've probably allowed it to be. So how can I explore that? I was finding it very hard to ask for what I wanted with men. So to open that up to women, I was really like, where do I start? You know. But I went to a conscious sexuality festival, and actually it was really wonderful. Well, I was terrified at first. I locked myself in the car, but once I got out of the car, I really enjoyed it. And what it was there were loads of tantra and intimacy teachers there from all across the world, actually giving workshops. Alcohol-free, drug-free, you know, I really, really valued it. But what was great is there was a lot of other women who were feeling the same, you know, wondering whether they were as straight as they thought. And you're, you know, if you've got you might be in a workshop where you're allowed, there's loads of practice with asking for what you want and stating boundaries, loads of that. So there was lots of opportunity to gently explore with other women. That was really beautiful. So that was a lovely way in for me, in quite a safe environment to explore with women. And what I have taken from that really is, so I definitely feel attraction to to men and women, but what I feel a real heart connection to women, I think because I'm a woman, and because also I feel the female experience going back generations and generations and generations in terms of sexuality is often one of pain and trauma, and I feel that as women there's a lot of healing that needs to be done, and I feel that I have had some connections with women that have been it's almost like we need another language sometimes, I think, because it's sort of, to say sex, I think we have a base vision of sex, and actually when I'm talking about sexual experiences or sexual touch, I'm meaning it in a spiritual, in a very spiritual, transcendent way. But I've had some experiences with women of sexual and intimate touch that has been really exquisitely healing, and that I think is a really beautiful thing and a beautiful way that women can connect. Yeah, one thing I keep coming up with that. Yeah, so I mentioned the healing, and we know through Me Too, and if you just think about your generations of women and the pain and trauma, that's just been, it's just there. You go back to the Old Testament and you can hear, tales of stoning women and being advocated and what have you. So you just, it's unprecedented, the scale of violence against women when it comes to sexuality, violence and suppression. So actually, I think that for me, like, connecting with women can be just a really profound and beautiful and healing experience. And because I have, and it's not saying that can't be done with a male partner, because it is, I experienced that with my male partner, but there's something about coming together with women that can be really, beautiful and healing and quite, that healing I think is very powerful on a big level. I don't know whether that made any sense.
Yeah, no, it does
Vaguely made sense, didn't it?
And also because they're not, for me, those things are different, like whether or not it's someone who, whether you're in a relationship with someone who is male or female or non-binary or exploring their gender or any, there's something about being open to the possibility and the difference and the healing and the acceptance of that is it is a very spiritual experience, because suddenly it feels more holistic. Because you're already breaking that kind of normative role that isn't, you're saying that all of this history is not what you want. And I don't this is not to say that those sexual experiences are exactly what happens in like when you're having sex with someone and you're breaking that, you don't suddenly think, oh, I'm breaking the patriarchy here. But that kind of understanding and that realization that you have a power in that, but that to accept that, and that's not to say that abusive relationships don't happen, but there's something different about it that can be quite healing, and that can be very much about saying, this isn't what I want, and this whole baggage that comes with me, I can put that to one side in this experience, and I can, or bring it in, but not allow it to dominate the experience.
Before I've kind of explored all this for myself, really, the sex that was, when somebody said sex, and if people around were having sex, it was generally happening drunk, or, in the early hours. It wasn't, and I think there's a lot of that. I do think there's a lot of kind of coming together, so in a very intimate way, but desensitising ourselves and not really being present. And I think somehow that being present with whoever it is and allowing a stillness, it's so Quaker in a way, like allowing a stillness, allowing spirit to enter, and we can be transformed in that, physically, spiritually, emotionally. So it's allowing that. So kind of, I have those experiences with men and women, and that's great. It's not, so
sometimes people are kind of funny when you say, do you schedule sex, and like the advising sex columns about that. Do you schedule sex? Is that apportioning time specifically set aside? Kind of reject that notion of it has to be spontaneous all the time, and it has to be in the early hours.
I think scheduling sex is a nice thing, really. I mean, somebody said to me, oh no, that's not nice because you take away all the spontaneity. And spontaneity can be great, but actually if you're connected with the same person over a period of time, it's quite hard to maintain that spontaneity. And especially if you've got, so what I am hearing a lot from, so I've got a a child, and I talk to a lot of other mum friends, and so what happens is you've got a lot of energy going towards these little people and dealing with household stuff and work stuff, and then how can you kind of like spontaneously have great passion with a partner? It's quite hard. So how do you do that? Because you're quite exhausted. So I prefer not to leave it until you're in bed at night, because I love bed. I'm in bed, I want to go to sleep, really. So, and also if you kind of think, so to make it earlier, just make it earlier in the day, as early as you can, so kids to bed, and then go and have some time, and then you can watch your telly and have your glass of wine or whatever. But to do it earlier, and that for me feels really nice. And I actually quite like to maybe sort of take some time for me, and light a candle, have a bit of stillness first. I quite like that. But and I'm quite into sort of experimenting with stuff like that. So thinking,
I think you mentioned in the book that you found that becoming a mother changed your understanding of sexuality as well, or led you to explore in different ways. And
it's such a kind of huge shift. It's like so funny. So I was just sort of thought I was a master at sex. I was like, this is what I do. I love it. And I've gone on this big sex journal and wrote the sex book, and then you get pregnant and you have a baby, and it's just like, holy moly. And I'd read in all the magazines, within 6 weeks you'll be able to have sex again. I was like, really, no, it's agony, and I was cut and stitched down there, and your body's being feeding and human, and it's such a shift. So and I kind of really just at first just really wanted to get back to where I had been, and it wasn't happening. So again, it was just a beautiful lesson, really, that I had to do. I almost just went back to the start, this journey I'd been on before. I just had to kind of lie, hold my heart, feel where my body wanted to be touched, and quite often it just wanted to be my episiotomy scar, just a finger on it, and I was just in floods of tears. So what happens to the yoni area, your kind of vulva area, vagina area, it will sort of hold trauma, and it will numb to stop that happening again. So quite a lot of people after childbirth are just numb there. So I just felt it was just uncomfortable. It's just but you can reactivate that with sort of tender touch and allowing, you can reactivate that area, being really tender with it. So I just had to go back. I just had to go back to the drawing board of myself and just put my hand on my heart and tune in and just go, so where do I want to be touched, and what do I want, and then to communicate with my partner. So go on a whole journey again, but it was very different because I was a mother and my body had been through this. So, and that's not, and I know I'll have to do that again. There'll be menopause, there'll be other things that will come into, and I'll have to kind of come back. It's just about coming back to yourself and just tuning in and going in stillness, just inquiring what you need. It completely shifted sex and sexuality, and I feel it does for most people, and so many people have been. And I'm really glad I was able to write about that in the book, because I think a lot of people have really resonated with that and have said, is there more? Can you write more about that stuff? Because it's such a big thing, and it's really hard to find that intimacy and connection time again with your partner. So
So a sequel in the works.
I'm working on a little thing at the moment of just how to support couples who might be going through that to connect and to find little exercises for intimacy. But who knows? Who knows?
But I mean, regardless, that sounds like something that is a very useful part of reconnecting, however that has happened, because some people's experience of childbirth is pretty horrendous.
It's traumatic,
but having had friends who've had very difficult labours and had to have cesareans, and like that amount of healing that the body needs to go through when that happens, I can't imagine what that feels like.
I think there's a lot of healing that needs to be done, and and childbirth is a big one, but also sexual violence. If you think how many women live with female genital mutilation in the world, this is an area of our bodies that whether we haven't experienced, it's unlikely that a woman won't have experienced anything like that. But even if they haven't, it's around, it's in the back of generations. It's just, they're everywhere. So I think there's just a lot of healing that needs to be done, and just, coming to ourselves very, very tenderly. And because I think that we can offer ourselves quite a lot of healing with that tender touch. So that's a start. Often that it needs, it might need some more professional help. But as a start, just coming to ourselves really tenderly and allowing that to sort of happen, and the tears to flow, and, whatever come up.
Yeah. Yeah, not feeling that kind of self-embarrassment of like, oh, I shouldn't be crying, why am I crying? But actually, like, if that's what you're feeling, just allow...
Totally, yeah, because that's been held for a long time.
Yeah. Thank you for coming to talk. I'm really glad this was really interesting.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
That was such a fascinating interview, and it's just the kind of stuff that we don't think or talk about generally.
Yeah, I think we have a bit of a shame culture around sex. And even when I think sort of specifically about how some people say things like, oh, I don't have a problem with LGBT people, but, you know, holding hands or kissing in public is just throwing it in your face. But that's quite a hard thing to challenge, because that comes from a lot of this history that we have around shaming LGBT people for sexuality. And generally, I think we're just scared to talk about this stuff. Even just talking with Lucy about it, it left me with a lot of thoughts and feelings about how we talk about this stuff in society, but also whether or not I talk about this in my own life, and the realization that I don't really very much. And so while some of the stuff she talks about, particularly in the beginning of her book, mirrors my own experience, have I ever really talked about some of those things with friends?
Yeah, it's hard to cultivate those spaces. It's not something I would generally talk about with any of my friends, regardless of their gender or sexual orientation. And when I particularly think about my male peers and growing up, you just wouldn't create a space where you could have those kind of honest conversations to that extent. And something that we kind of unpack in the interview with David from the Good Lad Initiative is that particular male culture of almost, I suppose, reinforcing some of that concept of shame or teasing, and whether that's sometimes is the cry to talk about this stuff, and what language we use, and whether that is the helpful language or not, which is also something that I think moves us nicely into the conversation that you had with Elsie.
Yeah, she's someone who researches this stuff. She's a lecturer. She specialises in youth participation in relationships and sex education. So it's quite interesting to hear two different but often quite reflective experiences about how to do inclusive sex education well with young people.
So yes, over to David and then Elsie.
My name's David Brockway, and I work for somewhere called the Good Lad Initiative. I manage our programme of schools work within that project. We work with boys aged 12 to 18 in UK secondary schools, and we run workshops with them in which we'll come in and start a conversation about masculinity, being a man, what that means, what it could mean, what it should means. We're basically aiming to start that conversation. We don't claim to have answers, we don't claim to have a version of what's the best way to be a man, but we do have the knowledge that there are some stereotypes or rules that a lot of young people consciously or subconsciously live by that might not be very good for them. So we want to create the opportunity for the young people we work with to have that conversation, to ask those questions, to talk to each other as well as to us, and through that find out what's best for them, what they want to be, who they want to be, and from there on go and explore that concept further.
On your website you mentioned that your aim is to create a world with positive gender equal relationships. What does that actually look like?
I think in essence it means respect. It means actually understanding who someone is, empathising with them and respecting their rights, feelings, abilities as a human. Have a more respectful environment in which people are free of a lot of the stereotypical expectations of what it being a man or being a woman is, and way forward in which people can actually be more free to put forward their own versions of who they are.
When I did sex education at school, I remember it was taught by a relatively feisty woman, and I went to an all-boys school, and she was furious that none of the male teachers were prepared to teach it. And we did, the standard, like, this is how it works, this is your STIs, let's put a condom on a banana. But then she was also, very, very good at fielding, the questions about sex and women and consent and prostitution, and she was very good. And what I'm getting is a picture of, men going and talking to boys about this. What's the importance of that? Is that something founded in the principles of the organisation?
Yeah, so when the project was started off, and this was by my predecessors, who were called Sarah Perry and Genevieve Dawson, they very much understood that there was a lack of men getting involved in work towards gender equality, and men who actually understood and had came to the work through a female-led perspective of saying, this is how it feels on the other side, so you've got to be able to put yourself in those shoes, or at least have that understanding. So it's always been very important that there are men going in and doing the work, but with that training and point of view. And then going forward in a more day-to-day level, it's important for the boys to see that men are prepared to come in and talk about everything from, there is the sex side of it, and talking about sex in a way that isn't just sort of laddie and sort of, oh, look at us getting laid type thing, which is how most boys do talk about sex, but there's a more caring side to it, and there's emotions involved, etc. But also our work goes beyond just sex, and so we're looking at lots of areas of masculinity, and there's a lot of power in just having someone come in and say to the boys, it's nice to be nice. You can be kind to each other for the next 3 hours, and we can celebrate that, and you get these sheepish looks, and then they can just see there are people who are prepared to do this, and our volunteers are a huge range of people. We've had some who have been amateur boxers or professional sports people, others who are in theatre or dancers, then sort of some who are just from every walk of life you can imagine, whether they work in insurance or marketing. We have a big range who hopefully the boys identify with as being someone who's similar to someone in their lives or someone they might be. And so there's a lot of power in just seeing regular people who might be them or look like them coming in having this conversation.
I would say, besides a handful of sex education lessons when I was growing up, a lot of the stuff was conversation, and even when would this have been? So 10 years ago, it was driven by pornography and what's out there on the internet shapes people's understanding of sex. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
A lot of thoughts, yeah. It's certainly a big problem for us as well as society. I mean, how to get around the ubiquity of pornography is incredibly difficult. And by the time we're working with year 9s, so 13 to 14, in the average classroom, I would say 80 to 90% of the boys we work with have got pretty pornified language and a pretty, very advanced understanding of what this concept is, as the language and the way we talk about it would suggest that it's not just they stumbled across it once. So I would certainly say it's everywhere. And I mean, one of the problems for us is that we can go in and talk to the boys and say, this isn't real. This isn't where we learn about sex. This isn't how it works. And most of them are pretty good at getting to the point of, it's porn. It's kind of over the top. But they also don't know where they do learn. In 2019, if you want to learn about sex as a teenage boy in the UK, it's hard for you to figure out where to do that isn't porn. Where are the positive representations of sex? The stuff that isn't pornographic. Game of Thrones, lots of sex in that, very little of it positive. James Bond, the classic sort of, you hear people saying, you learnt to kiss by watching Sean Connery. Like, you learnt to sexually assault someone by watching Sean Connery. It's not consensual. Theatre, drama, TV, where are these positive representations? I think there are some coming through. Sex Education, the TV show on Netflix, I think actually does a quite good job. I haven't seen all of it. There are examples coming through, but I mean, again, it's a tidal wave of negative portrayals. Back to porn. The abuse, the violence, the violent language, almost always directed towards women, that goes on, that can start to warp a young person's sense of what's normal and what's not, is really dangerous. And it's very difficult to get that message across without being patronising or very much telling someone this is affecting you.
So how do you do that then? What do you do when you go into schools and start talking to boys about this stuff?
So our approach in general is to be discursive and get them talking to each other outside of this session alone, that can be about sex that isn't in relation to porn or sort of just the pornified language around sex, I guess. Part of that is asking them to be a little bit vulnerable and actually open themselves up and have more serious conversations with their peers, to like other boys in their year, or get away from that idea of, as a man, you have to sort of always know what you're doing, you're in full control, etc, etc. One of our volunteers used a really good metaphor for some of the boys of saying, if you never knew how to play football, you hadn't been taught, you hadn't practiced before, would you just turn up to a game and presume it was going to go really well and that you would sort of, score a goal and your team would do fine? And they were like, no. Then why are you treating sex like this? You are allowed to make mistakes and sort of be clunky and all of that. What's important for us to say, what is dangerous, is the presumption that because I've seen this representation, that's what I do. And this is what other people want, and this is what I'm supposed to want, because that's equally dangerous, the idea of boys forcing themselves to do things because they think it's what's expected of them. When it comes to speaking about what sex should be, we obviously don't have an answer, because can't be telling young people this is what you should be doing. But we do ask them to think about the variety and that there are options. But what's more important is to say you are putting yourself into some pretty difficult and possibly dangerous situations if you're seeing something in porn or on television that you take to be sex and then try to replicate it, because that's just not how it works.
The question of what consent is has got to be a key question, really, in that sense. Consent so often is portrayed as a kind of legal thing.
Mm-hmm.
A kind of tick boxing exercise. We were talking before we put the microphone on, it seems like you have a completely different understanding of it.
Yeah, absolutely. While we totally understand the importance of all people knowing what consent is in legal terms, it is in a way a flawed word because it has to be used in the law. And in that case, you're using it to figure out if something is legal or not, and whether you have committed crime or whether you have engaged in healthy, acceptable sexual activity. And that's a really negative way to see the topic. It's an awful way to teach it. If you go in to talk to a group of 15-year-old boys and take the approach of you need to know what consent is, because if you don't, then you could be a rapist. Well, you probably don't need to think much further to realise that you've lost the group and you've made them feel awful about themselves. We're more looking at consensual relations. We go through a process in which we'll get the boys understanding that being consensual and understanding yourself and the other person or people involved on the sort of the same playing field is a process that's got to be going on throughout all aspects of a relationship, whether that be not just a sexual relationship, but your emotional, personal aspects as well, but also whether that's a one-night stand or whether it's with a long-term partner. The consensual nature has to remain in place, and that starts from kissing or touching someone right the way through to everything else you do. And we want to move away from this idea that you only need to know about consent in terms of it's the presence of an ongoing and informed yes, free from coercion, with the mental capacity to understand what you're doing. Important stuff, and we will talk about that to the boys, but only after we've gone through what we feel is the more important bit. Because if you've got to the point when you're asking yourself, do I have an informed yes from this person, we feel something's gone wrong already, that you shouldn't have needed to get there. Summed up in a really good example from one boy who said, if you're kissing someone and they don't like it at first, but then they do like it, is that consensual? And we'd already had our little chat, so I asked the boys to answer the question. They said no, because if they didn't like it at first, you shouldn't have been doing it. And we said, well, exactly, this is the point, because how had they been feeling beforehand? What had gone on to get there? So it's important to go back further and further and further and start with this point of, if you are engaging in some sort of sexual activity of someone, normally starting with some touching or kissing, there's got to be respect, care, listening, wanting them to have a good time, and crucially, that you are doing the same to yourself. Because this is another problem with the way in which a lot of consent is taught. It often falls into this pattern, always a heterosexual pattern, of men being seekers and women being gatekeepers. Of course, problem here is then that it builds into this dynamic of men are active, women are passive. Men enjoy sex, women don't, which really creates that flaw, or sort of the building block of a rape culture, in which women are seen as sort of not part of a sexual encounter. They're seen as men's pleasure within a sexual encounter. So we really need to move that dynamic to one in which we're talking to the boys about, and how do you show your consent? Because if you don't know how to show it yourself, you sure as hell don't know how to see it in someone else. So that empathy aspect is really important for us, but also to get the boys realising that they probably will find themselves in a sexual encounter at some point where it might get to a certain point where they'll feel uncomfortable, and that they need to understand they have the right to say, actually, I want to stop, I don't want to go any further. And there's an important gender dynamic to understand here, because a lot of the time in which women or girls might feel like that, they feel they can't say I want to stop because they're afraid of violence, afraid of the person ignoring them and deciding we're going to do it anyway, and that they could physically overpower them. With boys in heterosexual relationships, and in same-sex relationships to an extent, that's less often the case, but it's more of a case of my masculinity is going to be under threat. Everything in the back of the head, especially early on in their sort of sexual lives, I guess, is saying, this is what it's all about. Guys get laid. Isn't this awesome? I can brag to my mates about this, but oh no, what's happening? I actually feel a bit scared, I feel uncomfortable, I want to stop. There's a huge conflict going on there, and I think it's something that a lot of boys are aware of happening, but find it impossible to discuss. And so if we can get that conversation going about, are you checking in with your feelings of confidence? How's your self-esteem right now? Are you feeling comfortable to say to another person, I don't want to do this? Because if not, then there's something wrong in that encounter. And that might be from the way the other person's making you feel, but equally it's from how your peer group and your version of masculinity has made you feel. So we really need them to understand that that's something that they're allowed to question and think about and talk to people about. And in which case, you're then starting to understand that everyone else is going to have the same thing, and you'll be much more aware of another person's feelings in a sexual encounter, and therefore your ability to see signs of consent and signs of wanting to be involved in activity is going to be much higher.
There's two questions that come to mind that I could see someone might be thinking. One is the pros and cons of segregating boys and where that leaves people who don't fall into gender binary. And I guess the other question would be how much asexuality features into your conversations as well.
So yeah, on the second one, quite easy. We normally go through the LGBTQIA+ acronym with the boys and talk about being asexual and the extent to which different people experience sexual pleasure or desire. A lot of the time you've just got to point out, yes, this is a thing, and that for everyone there's different elements. From our perspective, we'd also talk about all of the ideas about sexual identity, about gender identity being on a spectrum. And so with being asexual, we would explain that some people may not feel the same sort of sexual desire, but that doesn't necessarily mean they won't be in romantic relationships and so forth. But also different people will feel different amounts of sexual desire as well. And so we find it important to always make sure that they understand not everyone is sort of always after sex. It's not the be-all and end-all, but if you are engaged in it, it's a very important thing to understand how it works. On the gender side, yeah, this is an ongoing one for us. We use gender-neutral language wherever possible. The boys will always slip back into talking about boys and girls, normally a heterosexual, heteronormative way. So we allow that to happen because it allows the conversation to flow, but always, ask, and who are we not talking about when we talk about just boys and girls? Or who are we looking at when we say men are attracted to women? And so remind them constantly that, there are different sexualities, different identities, different gender identities. When it comes to the workshops, we do have to treat the group as a male group because at its essence we're talking about masculinity and the way in which it is enforced, promoted, seen, which will be within binary terms. So we let the boys understand that gender isn't binary and that there are lots of different forms of gender identity and expression and understanding, but also that we do have to look at this idea of masculinity and how is that made. And doing both at the same time is really helpful because it allows a lot of the boys to say, if they can understand, oh, well, the way I enact being a boy or a man is different from the way this other boy in my class does, then it's possible that they can understand the variety of the gender spectrum as well.
What about when you're going into faith schools that might have particular perspectives around their understanding of sex and when you should be having sex and when you shouldn't, and that those messages that might have been received from quite early on?
It also depends on how the boys we're talking to treat their faith and the seriousness with which they approach it. For a lot of them, it can be a sort of card to pull out when it's convenient. So you'll have boys bragging about how they can't wait to get laid and sort of girls are easy and this, that and the other. And then when it suits them, turning around and saying, oh, but you shouldn't have sex before marriage, so I'm not going to answer that question. Even those who may be from a sort of pious, as it were, family and will go on to live a more pious life perhaps, will probably be going through a teenage period of questioning and seeing things differently and experimenting with their faith and their belief. Each school set their own sort of red lines when it comes to faith schools. So I've worked in some, for instance, Catholic schools who said, we've got the teachings of the Catholic Church which guide our approach, but also we don't actually have anything in our school rules that you're not allowed to talk about. I think sometimes there's been some really helpful faith-based discussions that have informed the conversations. Like we've had boys in a Catholic school saying, I've been taught that my body is a gift from God, therefore I should treat it as such, and that, you know, applying that to things like self-harm and the way in which you would have sexual relations has been a really useful place for us to have the conversation around. But it's sexuality and gender identity where it gets difficult. You're working with a large group at a time. We split the boys into groups of 20 who have 2 facilitators. And then you never know what you're going to get from the boys' own understanding. So, I mean, once I've had someone said, in the Bible it says it's illegal to be transgender. It just doesn't. And so you think, how am I going to deal with this? And then we've got boys as old as 15 who genuinely believe there's a passage in the Bible that says Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And you just think, this isn't faith, this is playground stuff you've heard. It's really difficult to tread that line on respecting faith and understanding, but also knowing when to say to the boys, I'm sorry, but this just isn't accurate, and therefore it's giving you a damaging narrative. One of our main things is to say that within Christianity, Islam, Judaism, there are rabbis, imams, priests who will explain that you can have faith and different sexual identities, lots of other ways of interpreting their religious texts. And so we'll say to the boys, if there are people who are that learned in the faith who can see different ways of interpreting it, then I think it's your duty to also read, question and learn and think about how you will interpret your faith. And if you want to go ahead and say, you know, this means that I can't have this sexual desire or do this and that, that's absolutely fine. But I do ask that you do yourself the service of actually going and doing that research, doing that learning. So as with our approach to masculinity, in which we're trying to get the boys to understand they have choice, it's the same approach here. Encourage them to be questioning, but also reminding them that you don't have to change everything.
Well, that's interesting, and I think it's really impressive how you obviously have a core approach and principles. Often when these conversations happen with boys, sometimes what will come up is, oh, well, men can get raped. And that's often not used in it. I don't know if it's like a way to try and have that conversation in a kind of cry for help, kind of, I want to talk about this, but I want to do it in a chauvinistic way. Or whether it's a way of kind of saying, well, I'm not interested in listening to the power dynamics of gender. And I wondered if that comes up.
Very good question, because yes, this does happen quite often, and sadly a lot of the time as a sort of attempted straw man or diversionary conversation. We find that really sad, because a lot of the time it is through what boys have, you know, seen or read online, or been effectively groomed into thinking online. Because a lot of boys will, before we've even talked about domestic abuse, will say, oh, but men get domestically abused as well. And I'll say, yeah, we do, that's a really big problem, we're going to talk about that. And then they'll look surprised, because they try to suss us out and say, oh, these are people who talk about gender equality and having sexual freedom, they're all these sorts of left-wing hippies who are going to think this, that and the other. But they're always seeing that in a very binary term, as though if you're pro women's emancipation and liberation, etc., you must be against men's. And that's one of the big points for us, of explaining that it just doesn't work like that, and then going into how you feel. Your life probably doesn't feel easy, and other people's might not feel easy, but the aim isn't to win that competition, understand other people's struggles. One of the easiest ways for us to do that is normally if you're talking about objectification of body image, and explaining that there are growing body image pressures on men and boys, and loads of the boys who work with are really aware of the pressure to have like the Love Island body or whatever it might be, and they can really understand that it's not a nice feeling. And then we explain, well, girls at your school will be getting that as well, but there's also like a massive history behind that we haven't really had to experience. You can still have the kind of like James Corden jolly fat man, as it were, approach and be celebrated for it in a way which women and girls still really struggle to sort of get that respect. And so we can make those little differences of saying like, no, your issue is not being ignored and you deserve validation, but that must come with equal respect for the struggles that others go through. I'm very much one to not say or to not mock someone who considers themselves to have legitimate concerns, because if it's legitimate to you and you feel that, then it is legitimate. So let's talk about it as though it's legitimate. If it turns out it's not and you are just putting forward a deliberately difficult point of view, we'll quickly get there by treating it as legitimate, but if we dismiss it, we won't get anywhere.
No, I agree, that's a really important thing to think about.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Elsie. I'm a Quaker. I do lots of stuff with children and young people's groups, and I'm a lecturer, and I've just this last year finished a PhD where I've been looking at sexual consent with young people. So I do lots of work where I think about relationships and sex education and thinking about how we can encourage and nurture a more ethical sexual culture, and particularly talk to young people in a language and terms that make sense to them.
Do you think there are specific things within a UK context then that means being able to have better conversations around sex with young people is really important?
I don't think the UK is particularly good at having conversations with young people about sex. I think there's a lot of research that suggests places like the Netherlands or other countries are way more open and liberal in their approach, just having open and frank conversations about pleasure, about safety. And I think in the UK there's a real mix. We're going through a period of transition, but there is still concern around how do we talk about sex in a way that doesn't over encourage it. And also there's a real desire to keep children innocent. So it means that there's a bit of a push and a pull between at what age is it okay and appropriate to start talking to children about sex. And then also that's about how are we defining sex. I think it's really appropriate to talk to children from a really young age about touch and being friends and the ways in which you communicate what you like and what you don't like. And that's all part of practicing for what can then become more kind of intimate and sexual encounters in different ways.
Different religious groups, whether they're Muslim or Christian or other faith groups, have led the movement sometimes against some of that education at a primary school level. How would you respond to that criticism that it's not appropriate at primary school to be talking about relationships and sex education?
It is something when you think about people from different religious and cultural backgrounds may have different expectations and values around relationships and around what family means and around who should be doing the teaching. But I think nothing happens in isolation. So I may have been brought up in a Quaker family, but actually I went to a mainstream school. I lived in a town that had one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates. There's lots of things that meant that it was really important that not just my family taught me about sex and relationships. And so I think that it's a key part of education is learning about what's happening around you and being able to understand that. And I think there's different arguments, because a really simple argument would be, well, people can keep themselves safe the more they know. So, information is power and protection. But I also think that's not a very youth-centered way of thinking about it. In these instances, it's parents and teachers who are anxious about talking to children about sex and relationships. All the research that I've done or all the conversations I have with children and young people is they want to know about it. This is something they're interested in, they're intrigued about, and it's better that they get full and correct information rather than seeking it elsewhere. And I think it can be done in a culturally sensitive way. I think relationships and sex education, especially at primary age, people aren't going in there saying, hey everyone, we're going to talk to you about penetrative sex today. They're going in there talking about what makes you feel happy when you're with other people. What if someone does something you don't like? How do you respond to that? Those are things that are really important in everyday life as much as in our sexual life.
What do you think it is that makes it awkward for teachers and parents to talk about that?
I think there's a real mixture of things. So there's a hangover from Section 28 brought in during Margaret Thatcher's government, and it was an amendment to local government acts that said that teaching about homosexuality as a legitimate lifestyle, that's how it was framed at the time.
Pretended family relationship.
Yeah, so exactly. So they spoke about, let's not pretend that a homosexual lifestyle could create a proper family environment. That was the framing of it. But also what was happening at the time with various nationalising of national curriculum things is teachers were getting a lot of their autonomy and their power taken away from them. People were saying the family unit should be the core unit. We don't think teachers should be teaching about things that aren't to do with maths and physics. And what that meant is a lot of schools and educators aren't sure what they're allowed to do without annoying parents or crossing boundaries. Section 28 was revoked in 2003, but it's really difficult for people to know whether or not you're allowed to out yourself. And the conversations that we're currently having about whether or not we're allowed to teach LGBT inclusive education, heterosexual people out themselves all the time. So teachers might say, oh, I did this with my husband at the weekend. If a man is to say, oh, I did this with my husband over the weekend, he's having to second guess himself in his workplace and think about whether or not he's allowed to say that.
Yeah, a friend of mine, she's a teacher, and she sometimes talks about her wife in class, or when she was wearing an engagement ring, some of her students would make assumptions. She played along with it, but actually it was quite a difficult space to navigate.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult because, so I do a lot of stuff in youth work. It's more appropriate in some spaces. So you might have, there's ideas around LGBT role models or youth workers that specifically run LGBT youth clubs, and part of what they do is they walk alongside young people and they share some of their experience too. And so the work I do when people are talking about consent and sex and relationships, if a young person asks me quite a direct question of like, when did you first have sex, or things like that, I will be honest about it, because I think it's important to break that barrier. And maybe that's a bit of the Quakery, being straightforward and honest and truthful about things, but also seeing the people you're talking to as an equal. Like the children and young people I work with, they're interested, they're inquisitive, and I don't think we should limit conversations. I don't think we should push them beyond where they're at. So, if someone's not asking me about sex or about pleasure, I'm not necessarily going to force it on them as a conversation, but we can start having the conversation.
Yeah, it's always interesting reflecting back on people's different experiences of what sex education looked like. The sex education I got in school was very much around, this is what STIs are, here's pictures of STIs, pretty much don't have sex without condoms. It was only heterosexual sex that was talked about, which is just very confusing later in life. That wasn't really a whole conversation.
There is a shift. I think that comes down to the individual teacher and how supported they feel to deliver what they want to deliver. I think there's a lot of newer teachers coming through who do want to deliver good, inclusive relationships and sex education, and who do want to have conversations that go beyond what their experiences were. I think everyone wants to do it a bit better than their sex and relationships education was. And I think now that relationships and sex education is going to become statutory, all schools are going to have to do it. I don't think that means that the quality is going to be consistent. I think there's a space for external people to come in who are perhaps more confident and practiced at talking about things like, how often do people actually say penis, vulva, vagina in everyday life? This is something that I've got practice doing in front of a room of 30 people, but lots of people don't have, and it takes a really long time to be able to not blush and set an example that actually this is not an embarrassing topic.
Yeah, I think I'm blushing now as I'm talking to you, being like, have I ever said the word vagina or penis at work or in any other circumstance where I've not felt awkward?
Yeah, and that's the problem. So there's a real thing around language. Mainly we've got quite a scientific language, or quite an innuendo-y, either quite childish or quite rude language about how we talk about sex and how we talk about genitals. And that's what we need to break. So that's part of the work that I want to do, is breaking that stigma around having these conversations. So it's awkward, right? But rather than be like, I need to avoid awkwardness at all cost, actually what we need to do is lean into some of that awkwardness and say, right, let's work through the awkwardness. Also teach people to hold a bit of awkwardness as well.
How do you go about doing that then?
In different ways with different people. I was with a friend and their daughter yesterday, their daughter's 10, and they said they've started doing relationships and sex education, and they write all the embarrassing words up on the board and then everyone has to shout them in the class. So it's just a way of like getting them used to saying the words in front of each other and being like, yeah, it's a bit funny, but let's get through it together. Again, with children, young people, a lot of parents are a bit worried about being like, oh, but if my child's saying the word penis, does that give the impression that they like know too much? Should we be saying frou-frou instead of vulva? And everyone has a pet name for their parts. That's quite unhelpful. Partly means that children don't necessarily know how our body works, which part of our bodies are for what. And that means if you're going for medical examinations, or if you have experienced some sort of sexual violence or exploitation, you don't have a language for talking about what happened, where hurts, what got touched, what didn't. So on that level, it's important. Also, just the anatomy of pleasure is really important, to know which parts of your body have extra nerves, or which parts of your body are more sensitive, or which parts of your body you don't like being touched, or knowing which bits are for privacy of your own home and which parts are okay to whap out on the beach or whatever. So I try just to use that language and be normal about it and not be embarrassed about it, and creating resources to help teachers to do that as well, and have conversations about consent, for example, is a different conversation that's difficult because it can sometimes be difficult to categorize different experiences.
So how do you go about talking about consent in a classroom full of lots of different children?
I think it depends where you go. I'm always going in as like an outside person, and I don't have a relationship with the class. And so it's a little bit based on if it's in a school, what the teachers think would be best, or they know the class better, but also, you know, I'm confident to hold this, I can do this, and I think it's good to do it mixed gender, again, because it's about saying this isn't a taboo topic that you can only talk about with your girlfriends or with the guys. And I think that's a problem too, is people don't have cross gender or multiple gender conversations about sex perhaps until they're a bit older or in smaller groups. Again, we learn that talking about sex is something to be done in small groups, privately, not openly. You have to kind of establish whether something was good or bad by how other people respond to it. So there's different ways of doing it. There's a guy called Justin Hancock, who's a really great sex and relationships educator, who has been working with someone called Med John Barker, and they developed like a handshake activity, and I've used it and developed it as well in different spaces, where you just get everyone to go around the room and shake everyone's hands. And so you just say, go shake everyone's hands, and you say, you know, how did that first handshake feel? And everyone goes, oh, it was all right, or it's a bit weird, actually, we don't usually shake hands with each other. And you go, okay, so what about if we do round 2, negotiate your greeting with everyone? So then you're negotiating and you start, and would you like a handshake? How firm would you like your handshake? Okay, you don't want a handshake, would you like a hug? Are you a fist bump person? So then you've got the second layer where it's much more negotiated. And then a third round where actually there's something in between, because I think when we talk about that negotiation where you make it really explicit, that's also really weird. That's an example of awkwardness that we need to work through and just get used to. Also an in-between. So actually, I can read your body language, or I might put my hand out and you might respond really warmly to it, and I can sense from that, and I might go, I'm going to go in for a hug if that's okay. There's different ways of doing it with different people and in different contexts. But one of the things that we learn about that from that handshake, but also from a lot of research, is we're all really bad at saying no. So actually, if you were in a bad mood and didn't want a hug and I just went in for it, I might feel that you're a bit tense and obviously not enjoying this hug, but we've done it now. So to save face, we just finish it and have a rubbish hug. And that was not the end of the world, but also probably not good for either of us in the end. So that's a really good way of just starting the conversation and having a conversation around, in what other spaces do we negotiate boundaries, do we do consent? And then you can work up to talking about it in different sexual contexts. So hand holding, kissing, again, it's about what is sex actually. A sex act could be just holding hands for some people. Kissing, it could be lying next to each other with clothes on, it could be naked. There's so many things that happen before some sort of kind of penetrative or orgasmic sexual experience is going to happen, depending on who you're with. It's just about thinking, how do we do negotiation? And it's difficult and it's awkward. And that's the bit that I want to work with teachers on, because it's really difficult to have a conversation with young people who are like, yeah, but what if this happens? How would you communicate with the other person to check in about that? And so it's the checking in that needs to be encouraged, but that is difficult. I think educators are quite anxious about being black and white about it. Would this be a legal experience or would it be an illegal experience? And that for me is what we need to move away from, because I think often we talk about consent the law says you have to get a yes in order for it to be consensual experience. And I think so many people know that doesn't happen, but they've still had a consensual encounter. But if I'm an educator in front of 30 people, do I feel like it's okay for me to say, well, actually, we don't always have to say yes. Sometimes, you do flow with it. You can read body language. And I can understand that as quite a risky, difficult conversation to have. It's about finding different ways and scenarios where you can work through, and essentially, rather than making the conversation about yes, no to sex, make the conversation about supporting young people to develop a vocabulary and the confidence to check in with each other.
Yeah, that healthy sexual communication that doesn't really get taught, but there isn't really a clear way of finding out how you learn it either. Where do you think most of the messages that young people are getting about sex is coming from at the moment?
That's a really tricky one. I think people immediately go to TV shows and concerns around pornography and things like that. A lot of it does come from there, but I also think we don't credit young people with enough intelligence and agency to know that that's not real life. But they're still important messages. How often do we see good consent happening in TV shows? Also, where do we see it within families? Children are told to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Can they negotiate that? It's a yes or a no. School's a difficult place to teach about consent, because once you start unpacking the concept, then it's like, well, I didn't consent to wearing my school uniform, but I have to wear it. When we're doing consent education, we're trying to teach people to say no. In schools and in a lot of families, you learn that saying no to adults in particular gets you into trouble. So you're not encouraged to say no. And so what we see is when people dissent or they act out, so when children are naughty and performing like, no, I don't want to do this. So they're not saying no directly, but maybe they're kicking the table instead or disengaging from the homework sheet that they're supposed to be doing or whatever. That is a performance of no, but we ignore it. So actually, there's lots of other spaces that are not sexual at all, where we're not learning about good consent. And it's a really difficult one. Some of the anxiety that parents and teachers have around teaching about consent, teaching about boundaries, teaching about being assertive about what you want and you don't want, counter some of the intergenerational hierarchies that we have in everyday life. You know, I have to ask to go to the toilet when I'm at school. That's telling you that you know your body, but actually someone else has got to give you permission to go and do what you need to do with your body.
I feel like I have lots of things to think about in some of the things you've said, particularly around parenting and how do we deal with hierarchy. It makes me think about a Quaker parenting style, what that might look like in terms of addressing some of those hierarchies and having an equal relationship. We've talked before about creating spaces in which children can grow into their own wholeness. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
I think it's a really difficult one because in parenting, it can be really difficult to put boundaries in place, but we also know boundaries are a bit of a sign of love. And I think it's an interesting jump, but sometimes the stuff around sex and consent is, no, I don't want to do this, but I do want to do this. And knowing that you can put boundaries in place, but that's not going to affect a relationship is really important. So actually, I think in parenting, if you're saying, no, bedtime's at 8 o'clock, it's always at 8 o'clock. And that's partly because we're looking after you, you want to make sure you have enough sleep, but it's also having a conversation and making people understand that. I think encountering boundaries throughout your life is really important because you learn a lot about yourself, about how you push them, but also I think if boundaries are really fixed, then that's also helpful. Do you make things stuck in an unhelpful way? But we acknowledge that people change and grow. One of the children's rights is acknowledge developing capacity. So not every 10-year-old is the same. Not every 15-year-old is the same in terms of cognitive, mental capacity to understand things, in terms of information they've got, knowledge they've got, what they've got access to. So again, with relationships and sex education, it's not about saying that we absolutely have to teach every 10-year-old about menstruation right here, right now, but there should always be access to that information for when they want it and when they need it. And so that's the same about our parents willing to have slightly awkward conversations, or even say, that's something I feel a bit awkward about having a conversation, but let's give it a go. It's about modelling that awkwardness and saying, I don't know everything. I do see that in a lot of Quaker spaces. I think there's a lot more acceptance of not knowing. And I do a lot of stuff with young people. I tend to work more with 11 up, but a little while ago I did some work with the 7 to 9s. You know, and they're really interested in things and they know a lot. So we're having conversations with them about Extinction Rebellion and the fact that the world is going to end. Well, why can't we also have conversations about where children come from? People are starting to make decisions and have conversations about whether or not they are themselves are going to have children because of climate crisis. So why are we not having those conversations in some small, understandable way with other children? I think the boundaries thing, I want to go back to that. I think boundaries are really good. And I think we have to learn. And I think parents can model that boundaries can be put in place, that they can be respected, but they can also be negotiated. And I think it's about encouraging a language around being able to say no in different ways and know you can have no heard, but that someone is still there. And I think with a lot of the teenagers that I work with, or people who are kind of thinking about or have recently had sex for the first time, there is so much anxiety around, but if I don't have a particular kind of sex right now, the partner that I'm with or the people around me are going to think I'm frigid or I've had too much sex. And there's a fear that your boundary means that people are going to dislike you, disown you, leave you. If you've got the security and the knowledge that people that matter can cope with a boundary, that's a really important thing to think about. And it's complicated, it really is. You know, I don't want to pretend that it's easy to have that conversation in the same way as it's not easy to put your child to bed when they're kicking and screaming. But I think it's important to work through it. And I think it's not just about parents. And again, that's a space where Quaker communities that really value and support and uphold their families and children, I think there needs to be a lot more time and effort, not just lip service into saying, oh, it's so great that we've got families coming to meeting, but actually thinking about how can this meeting be part of the village and raise the child? How can they be part of offering different conversations? Because also children don't always want to ask their parents about sex. So I do think more could be done in some Quaker spaces to nurture that community where people learn from one another and learn from the children. Like a Quaker meeting, we respect the silence. We know that you don't stand up and give ministry halfway through someone else's. And that's also part of learning. It's about navigating an interesting meaning for worship. You're negotiating with yourself. Do I feel moved to speak? So you're listening to your body, you're listening to your heart, you're listening to your head. So it's an internal thing. But you're also thinking or feeling, do others need to hear this? And then someone else stands up. So you know you need to wait for a little while. And so it is kind of a silent negotiation. You don't have a conversation like, oh, I think I might say this thing. What do you think? So in a way, I think that's quite a nice way of learning to trust your inner leadings, which in some ways I think is easier to do in a quiet space like meeting for worship than in everyday life. It can help to think about how we read a room. How do we read other people, not just by verbal communication?
Yeah, and then if that's something that's part of your normal practice, then what does that look like in other spaces where you don't quite have the same quiet space, but actually learning to trust yourself in what you're thinking, and where's the level and boundaries around that as well in other situations?
And how would I feel about getting a no here? And so that's the thing, particularly in sexual consent, is about, I did for a while, I practiced being like, hey, would you like to have sex with me? And waiting for a yes please and a no thanks. It's awkward, it doesn't work, but it's also really clunky because my understanding of sex might be different to someone else's understanding of sex. Or being that overt about it is a turn off for some people and a turn on for some people. Even if then I got a straight up yes, that means we still need to negotiate how that happens as we go. You know, or actually it might start to hurt. Oh, actually, no, I'm not enjoying this right now. Can we try something else? And so in a way, you need to know that not only can you hear a no, but also your question's not to, this is exactly what we're doing, and if it doesn't happen, it's not good. Can we share and navigate an experience together?
Yeah, which is a weird and very long question to ask at the beginning.
And you don't know how you're going to feel about it too. It may be an entirely consensual encounter, but it wasn't pleasurable. And then afterwards you look back on it and you think, oh, did I really want that? Or could I have communicated better? Or did I create space for no? Did I create enough space for alternative sexual practices to happen? Was I just doing what I thought was expected of me, or you know, what I've seen on TV, or was I actually responding to what my body wants? And we're not taught to know what our body wants and what's pleasurable, and to explore and practice that.
Yeah, I guess going back to the children and young people, thinking back to when young people first have sex, that is often the awkward moment in particular that then makes it even harder to kind of think about that later. You might grow and develop and change in the way that you think about sex and how you navigate it as you grow and mature and change. But then actually, how do we make it easier from the first instance of sex?
I mean, good on you if your first ever sexual encounter is the most positive, orgasmic, pleasurable thing ever. It takes practice. Who is that first sexual encounter with? Is it with yourself? Is it with someone else? Sex is a practice. Even if you've got 40 years of experience of having sex, but you're now with a new partner, you have to learn how you are with that new partner. I think it would be unhelpful for us to say we need relationships and sex education to teach people how to have amazing sex the first time. I think we can teach them to have good negotiation, to feel able to explore what's good for them and what's not good for them with different people in different spaces. And I think solo sex, encouraging that, having conversations around masturbation as a way of pleasuring yourself, having a nice time, but also learning about yourself is great. But then also saying, and therefore, because you do know about yourself, you know you're allowed to say what you want. And I think that's particularly important for young women or people who identify as women, because, you know, there's so much that says that women are not encouraged to talk about sex. Actually, the kind of ideal heteronormative idea around sex is that women respond to the desires of men. So women's pleasure has been really ignored in a lot of ways, but also there's not been much of a language. Also, how do we just say, young women, it's totally okay to say, actually, I know that penetration doesn't do it for me and that I need 10 minutes of stimulation on my clitoris and more to the left. Like, if you actually know that about yourself, great, say it. But in saying that, you out yourself as someone who has practiced. someone who's perhaps had multiple partners before. So then you're doing this dance between, oh, if I say what I want, then I'm perceived to perhaps be a slut or to be overly sexual or to know too much about myself. And so that's the stuff that needs breaking down. And so when we're having conversations about consent and sexual negotiation, they have to happen alongside. Sex is fine, it's a good thing. And you know what, it's great if you know about your body and you can be directive to another person about what you know you like, but also you can explore and you can experiment. But we know that experimenting can go wrong. So then you've got to do that in a space where you know there's safety to say, oh, I'm not sure if I like this, and for there to be like a pause. Because actually, if you say, oh, I'm not sure that I like this, and in the back of someone else's head, they're like, oh my God, if I just pushed your boundary to a point where now, you know, you could say that I've raped you, that's really unhelpful. And so that's why I think, going back to what I said before about relationships and sex education, if we're just teaching about it from a legal perspective, you reduce anyone's ability to have a conversation about, let's explore. If it goes wrong, we can manage this.
And I guess also knowing, though, that if, say, you did say that, but they kind of pushed through it and kept going anyway, that pushing past that boundary is a problem and leads to sexual assault.
Yeah, and then being able to label it.
Yeah.
Super important. And again, this goes back to not only has women's pleasure been kind of ignored, so as women's experiences of violation. And so because everyone knows someone else who has had a boundary pushed, but it was not perceived to be a big enough deal to do anything other than maybe tell one of your friends about it and be like, yeah, that was rubbish, then, you know, we don't see it as kind of a big enough issue to then address, whether that's one-to-one or whether it is then to kind of escalate it and talk to other people about it or not. So it's, in a way, I think if we can celebrate no saying and be like, if someone says no, that's a really great thing because you've done consent well, you've created a space where they can say no, but also where we know that no is not, no can be an absolutely no, I don't want anything, but no can also be an opportunity to explore something else.
Okay, well, thank you very much for chatting. This was really great. After all those 3 interviews, are you any clearer on what a Quaker take on sex is?
I think as much as you can ever sort of be clear on what Quakers think, I think it's obvious that there are Quakers who are engaging this topic and engaging with the issue in a really positive and helpful way. And whether that's trying to explore their own sexuality without the negative baggage of society, or whether it's about going into society and trying to challenge that stuff, I guess it's heartening to me to see that this is not like a narrow understanding of what sex is, like it must be this. But it being part of this wider human experience and tied in with all these issues. So yeah, let's go out, engage with them. I think actually like some of the stuff that David and Elsie were talking about is absolutely stuff I would associate with Quakers. It's about non-violence and justice and equality. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that a Quaker take on sex is one that understands it in a context of Quaker non-violence and about exploring peaceful relationships and peace building and communication and all sorts of stuff wrapped up in that, which just goes so much broader. And we could have had a completely different episode of this podcast looking at the Quaker peace testimony and sexual violence if we wanted to. And, you know, if you think about that the other way around, what would a positive, peaceful world look like? It would be one in which we have healthy sexual relationships where the power imbalances in society don't exist and therefore don't allow for abuse to happen. And okay, so that's maybe a bit utopian, but if the peace testimony means something, it also means peace between individuals as well as in broader society. And all of that stuff around the fact that we've inherited the shame culture around sex, you know, which Britain has also exported around the world, is all part of tackling that, is a part of building a more peaceful and just society as well.
Yeah, and this is one of the more eyebrow-raising topics to cover, and you know it gets awkward at times, but I think it's arguably sort of one of the most important things that we could be talking about, because while wider society is dodging all this stuff around sex, like we talked about with David, you know, pornography is everywhere. Sex is portrayed in really unhelpful ways in the media all around us. It's there, and if we don't engage with it, that feels like such a risk. It feels to me very much like a Quaker putting their faith in action kind of thing, to be challenged, that to be trying to try and build a better world.
And we've only touched on this topic. We haven't talked about asexuality. We haven't talked about, you know, the relationship with racial discrimination and sex. We haven't talked about gender identity. There's so much that we haven't talked about. I actually hope that people have noticed that we haven't talked about it, because maybe we can talk more about it.
Yeah, this definitely feels to me like it's the beginning, and so often these conversations lead on to stuff. But hopefully, it's a great introduction to a Quaker take on sex. And if you want to explore more, I mean, there's already stuff in this show that you can then go out and explore. There's Lucy's book. You can find out stuff from our speakers. We'll put links to things like the Good Lad Initiative in there, and hopefully, this is the beginning of seeing things more positive. You're liberated to go out and talk about all this stuff.
And if you want to share thoughts with us, you can find us on social media at British Quakers using the hashtag #AQuakerTake, or feel free to email me on elizabethp@quaker.org.uk.
Yeah, but you can't really email me anymore because this is the last podcast I'm going to be doing as a member of Quakers in Britain staff.
It took a little while to get this one sorted with John leaving. So if you noticed a bit of a gap, that's why.
But it's not the end, because I've actually left Quakers in Britain to become Woodbrook's communications manager. So in 2020, we've agreed that we'll continue the podcast joint as a Woodbrook and Quakers in Britain thing, which feels really good, I hope.
What is Woodbrook, John?
So for those who don't know, Woodbrook is a Quaker study centre where they do lots of research about Quaker stuff and training, and we provide courses. We also have online courses, and we travel out to Quaker meetings and other places around the country to share Quaker learning. So we can expect more of the same. The Quaker Take is not changing, but we can hopefully more easily tap into that knowledge that Woodbrook has and all of the really cool speakers that I hopefully have access to.
Yeah, so stay tuned for our joint effort.
Hopefully it's going to be a good 2020 with lots more Quaker takes.
Thank you very much for listening.
Go well, friends.